Welcome to the last sessions of the ICArEHB Dialogues. In this series, we've explored the origins of human behavior, coastal adaptations, stone tools, and now we turn to something more recent, and that's the origin of agriculture, which in my opinion can provide not only insights into the past, but also can help us into the future. And for those of you who are new to the format of the session, we ask two researchers, one from ICArEHB and one from outside the ICArEHB family, to present their viewpoint on the topic. And then the audience is free to ask questions to the guests and lead to a fruitful dialogue between all of us as a community. And today we are very lucky to have Professor Dorian Fuller from the University College London and Dr. Hugo Oliveira. Thank you, I've been practicing that one. So who's an FCT fellow at ICArEHB. And so to begin with Professor Fuller, I mean, I don't know really where to start. I mean, he's a renowned archaeobotanist, botanist, as well as a blogger. Please check out his great blog on the archaeobotanist. He received his PhD from the University of Cambridge in 2000, and since then he's been a full-time lecturer at UCL. Alongside his extremely busy teaching schedule, he has authored over 300 articles, books, chapters, as well as successful funding applications from NERC and ERC, to name but a few. But where I became aware of his work was during my PhD, and prior to this point, I had been raised, so to speak, on a diet of Near Eastern plant domestication, and he opened my eyes to the story of agriculture and plant domestication that was taking place in other regions of the world. And his numerous papers, in my opinion, go beyond a discussion about the archaeobotanical record, but the role of agriculture in the evolution of human societies, as well as the potential impact of early food producing systems on the climate. And so it's a great pleasure to have you here, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And it's a shame you're not here. Hugo Oliveira always wanted to be an archaeologist, but was put off by a school careers advisor, however, and persuaded to study biology. Thankfully for us, he returned to the archaeology fold, first in his master's and then as his PhD that he received also from the University of Cambridge. His work has focused on unlocking the secrets of plant domestication via genetic analysis, and mainly focusing on cereals and legumes. He's more recently turning to drugs, that is opium. We received our FCT fellowships at the same time, and he has been central to the development of the research group, the Development of Complex Societies, which I'm lucky enough to be a coordinator of. Okay, so with that, if you guys want to add anything in there, you okay? Without further ado, Emily is now going to start the videos. And so please stay tuned. Yes, please stay tuned to the discussion at the end and further announcements about next year's dialogues. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Dorian Fuller, Professor of Archaeobotany at University College London. And I'm very sorry I can't be with you in person, but I'm looking forward to our discussion today. So what I'm going to do is give you a half-hour whistle-stop tour of recent advances in the study of plant domestication and the origins of agriculture, in particular through the archaeobotanical evidence, so the evidence of archaeological plant remains. Now, as a place to start, we should think about what agriculture is and its significance. So in a very simple sense, we can think of agriculture as a way in which people have changed landscapes and made them artifacts and have changed the relationship with the natural world. Its impact is quite profound, and in evolutionary terms, it's very recent. So if we think of our species as being around 200,000 years old, maybe it's a bit older than that. Farming has only been around for, at most, about 10,000 years. So that's less than 5% of the age of our species. And in fact, for most of the world, farming is younger than that. But we're talking about only around 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. So the transition to farming in, say, Thailand or South India is about 4,000 years ago. And some parts of sub-Saharan Africa is later than that. Now, of course, the New World has a different time scale because, people have only been there less than 20,000 years, and so farming has been around for close to 50% of the human history of the New World. In either case, the impact is profound, and human populations have been allowed to grow from estimates of sort of only 5 to 10 million at the start of the Holocene 10, 11,000 years ago to, of course, modern populations. So where did it begin? Well, what this map shows is a kind of updated map for what we call centers of origin. And these are places where there are a series of domesticatory relationships developed between hunter-gatherer peoples who start to cultivate and take plants out of the wild or animals and domesticate them. And there's somewhere between 13 and 24 centers of domestication around the world. These are kind of plausibly independent centers, and this map shows about 20 of them. Some of them are early Holocene, so older than 8,000 years, but the vast majority are middle Holocene, so between kind of 8,000 and 4,000 years ago. All these cases allow us then to study them in terms of parallel evolution. So there's parallel evolution of domestication in the plants. Of course, there's parallel evolution in culture in terms of becoming agricultural societies. Now, if we're going to study the origins of agriculture, we need to take a step back and be clear about what we're talking about. And I will use 3 different terms quite precisely. They often get confused, and in the older orthodoxy, these things were kind of all equated, but that's a kind of sloppiness of language and sloppiness of thinking. So domestication, cultivation, and agriculture are not the same thing. Domestication is really about the plant. Domestication implies morphological and genetic changes in the plant that make the crop, the domesticated plant, different from its wild ancestors. So it's undergone evolutionary change, and we'll come back to that. Now, cultivation is really about the humans. It's what humans do to create an ecology. So cultivation is creating an ecology through human action. So it's something people are doing. And then as plants enter that ecology, they're completely wild plants, but over time in that ecology, those plants adapt and become different. They become domesticated plants. That, of course, implies that there's a period of pre-domestication cultivation where humans are creating that ecology, but the plants have not yet undertaken those genetic changes. And then agriculture is something else still. So agriculture is something people do, but it's really cultivation on scale. It's cultivation to the point where it's transforming the landscape on a kind of larger scale. And I think the way we can kind of try to measure it archaeologically is it's really an economic change. So you can cultivate a few plants, but if most of what you do for your calories is hunting and gathering, you're still a hunter-gatherer. If most of your calories come from the plants that you cultivate, then you're in an agricultural economy. That, of course, also implies that there's a gray area, an intermediate zone of intermediate economies, which could be a topic for another lecture. So that period of pre-domestication cultivation is really quite crucial. It's our kind of key time scale for each crop, a key period for each crop against which we can think about how that crop is changing, how fast and what is changing and in what order, and in which we can relate that then to the ecologies that people are creating through the human actions of cultivation and how that is selecting for those changes. And so this is a kind of entanglogram, an entanglement of traits, which shows things that people are doing there in white, and things in gray there are changes in the plant that come about as a kind of adaptation that co-evolves with them. So loss of dormancy, increase in seed size, reduction of dispersal aids like long spiky awns, evolution of non-shadowing. These are all things that occur in the plant as a result of that interaction with people. And so one of our challenges as archaeobotanists is to identify this period of pre-domestication cultivation and document in that period both how the plants are changing and then how that relates to the cultural practices that are driving those changes. Now, to do that, we need to unpack then domestication. So there's a couple of key traits of domestication that we can study archaeologically. There are additional traits that are harder to study, but I'm going to focus on two that are relatively easy to study. And one is the trait of non-shattering. This is really fundamental. The top left there is, in my hand, are some spikelets of wild barley. So each grain of wild barley is packaged in a spikelet with a very long awn. Each spikelet is like a projectile point, so it falls off the plant and it sticks itself into the ground. The domesticated form of barley, which you can see in my hand on the right, all the grains stay together on the ear and they don't come off. They have to be broken off, and they have to be broken off through human action. So human labor separates the seeds in the domesticated plant. In the wild plant, as soon as the seeds are mature, they fall off. Just a slight breeze is more than enough. So that's a physical change which we can detect in rachis remains, and the picture on the top right are examples of a wild and a domesticated type archaeological barley rachis. And we also understand through genetics that there are key mutations. It tends to be a major recessive mutation, we think, in barley that is controlling that. So that's been selected for. Now, from the point of view of the plant, it actually means the plant is very bad at dispersing its seed. The domesticated plant is reliant on the human farmer to disperse the seeds. So it's no longer independent in terms of reproducing itself. From the point of view of the farmer, it's much easier to harvest. It's much easier to get a high yield. And the pictures at the bottom show wild rice at the left and domesticated rice, and then how we can compare the spikelet base on rice to tell the domesticated type, which is torn out, versus the wild type, which is round and smooth. And again, we understand some of the underlying genetics. In the case of rice, we're looking at the interaction of two or three different genes that are working together to cause that. This is something that we can detect archaeologically. So another trait that we can look at archaeologically is seed size. Now, it tends to be the case that seeds get fatter with domestication. In fact, for every field-grown seed crop, we can demonstrate that that's the case. The picture at the top are modern examples of domesticated species, different forms of domesticated rice, barley in the middle, melon, pea, lentil, and mung bean, and their wild relatives across the bottom. And you can see the wild relatives tend to be thinner, skinnier, not necessarily shorter, but thinner. Now, we think that what's driving that evolution is, again, the new ecology that people have created of cultivation. If you think of a cultivated field, it's a blank slate, it's clean soil. So it's what I would refer to as the level playing field effect. You have a clean soil, you put seeds in that soil. What those seeds are trying to do is germinate to create roots to get into that soil where the water and the nutrients are, and to put leaves up to get the sunlight that they need. And those seeds are all competing with each other. So any seed that has an advantage that can get its roots established quicker and its above ground leaves larger and established quicker has more real estate, more soil from which it can get water and nutrients, and more access to sunlight, and it will shade out its competition. So you have all these siblings or cousins of the same species competing to get established. And fatter seeds have more calories in them, and so those seedlings germinate more quickly and overtop their competition. So we don't need any human intentionality in this. We have humans create this field, this new ecology. The seeds compete with each other, and over time that selects for variants that have advantages in getting established. So those are two traits we're going to look at archaeobotanically, and I'll try to walk quickly through three examples. The first example comes from Eastern Asia, and it is the domestication of Asian rice. This map shows the distribution of archaeological rice sites, and the color coding shows the kind of approximate age. And so you can see these kind of red hot spots. There's two red hot spots there in China, one around the middle Yangtze and one in the east near Shanghai, what we call the lower Yangtze region. And I'm going to focus just on the lower Yangtze region. So these are our two main candidate areas for rice domestication. And so if you've zoomed in now, you can see a map, the Taihu Lake there, and there's a kind of a nose shape, and Shanghai sits on the kind of crest of the nose, modern day Shanghai. And south of Shanghai is this Hangzhou Bay. So it's sites that are really around Taihu Lake and Hangzhou Bay that have been fairly intensively studied, and when we get the first really systematic archaeobotany in this region carried out in 2006 on a project at a site called Tenlo Shan that I worked on. What I'm going to do here to illustrate how we go about this is look at material from 3 sites, which are pictured here. Tenlo Shan, which dates back to about 5000 BC and has 3 subphases. Shaoxie Shan in the top right, which dates to about 3900 BC and is occupied for about 100 years. And Maoshan, you can see that huge excavation. A lot of these excavations, both Maoshan and Shaoxie Shan, are in advance of development. So Maoshan is now sky-rise apartment buildings, and Shaoxie Shan, in fact, is the high-speed rail line between Shanghai and Beijing. So it's just sort of west of Shanghai, and we were able to excavate it. The Chinese colleagues excavated there, and I was able to be involved in a sampling program in 2008, I think it was, when they were building that high-speed rail. Anyways, so those are the 3 sites. Maoshan dates from about 3300 to 2300 BC. And through systematic archaeobotanical recovery, we get assemblages of wild plants and weedy plants, but lots of rice. And we can pull those spikelet bases out of rice that tell us about whether it is shattering or non-shattering. And we can say, is it the wild type? Is it the domesticated torn type? We have a third category, which I've labeled here as immature, which has a kind of protruding vascular system. That's one you can get that when rice is harvested green, whether it's wild or domesticated. So it could go either way. And of course, why you would have more of it is if you're harvesting wild rice, the wild form shatters when it's mature, and those mature seeds fall into the mud and the muck, so they're hard to harvest. So if you're harvesting wild rice as a hunter-gatherer or an early cultivator, you're going to target the plants before all the grains are mature, because if you wait for them to all be mature, they'll all be in the water and the mud. Anyway, so you can have a series of phases here. So you've got 3 phases at Tenlo Shan, Shaoxie Shan, and 3 phases at Maoshan. And you can see that proportion, the blue, the domesticated morphotype, creeping up over time, and the disappearance of that red wild type. Now what that tells us is we don't have the very beginnings of cultivation or the very beginnings of the selection process for this morphotype, but we have the second half of the process, the kind of fixation of the domestication trait. And this is over a sort of 2,500-year period. So that allows us to see directly the rate at which this is evolving and becoming fixed. So what we can do with data like that from those and other sites is plot them on a timeline. So here we've taken those data and plotted them against a median age, and there's some additional data from other sites. And here I've even compared different ways of estimating the proportion of the domesticated type. So I have a Chinese colleague, Jingyun Fei, who's in the past included what I call the immature type with his domesticated type. So essentially saying definitely wild versus not. My earlier publications, I tended to assume all the immature type was wild, so that's a kind of underestimate, and the truth is in between. So we can come up with a kind of mean and range, which is what this shows. In any case, what you can see is that there's this process by which it goes up, and then it kind of levels off as it gets up towards 90 or 100% of the domesticated type. So we're picking up the end of that domestication process. The beginnings are still a little bit fuzzy, and it could be there's a kind of long process where it's in some sort of a equilibrium or semi-domesticated state, and that requires more research. The other thing to note is that, of course, once the plant is non-shattering, of course, it now lends itself to adaptation of new technologies to make the harvest more efficient. And what we see is the introduction of harvest knives. And I've got some pictures of stone harvest knives there at the left. And these are little things that you strap to your hand, and you can harvest off the panicles of rice or millet. And they appear in the lower Yangtze region around 3300 BC. And so at the end of the domestication process. So this also tells us that the harvest tools are not driving domestication. That's an idea that was around in the 1980s and 1990s, that people developed technologies and that drove domestication, things like sickles or harvest knives. But in fact, those are adaptations on the part of culture to the genetic changes once those are becoming fixed. Now we can also measure grains. We can take our rice grains and measure their width. And so this is a plot of mean and standard deviation of archaeological rice grain assemblages from lots of different sites in the Yangtze Valley, plotted against time, and you can see that gradual creep upwards in the average. So that's that evolutionary process in rice grain. Now, the final thing we can ask is when in this process does rice become the staple food? So if we go back to that site of Tenlo Shan that I worked on and talked about, it has rice that's partly domesticated, partly wild type. So it's under pre-domestication cultivation. It also has lots of evidence for wild foods and potential staple foods. Things like acorns, which it has storage pits full of tens of thousands of acorns. It also has large amounts of shell and remains of the water chestnut and something called the foxnut, qian shi, which is another aquatic plant with starchy nuts. So rice is actually just a co-staple with all of these other wild foods. So a very simple thing that we can calculate is what percentage of all the recovered plant remains from a site are rice versus everything else, which includes these wild staple foods. And that's what the lower graph here shows. It's the percentage of rice over all of other plant remains. So when we go back to Tenlo Shan, which I've labeled at the bottom, you can see that rice creeps up from being something like 17% of all plant remains to nearly 40% of all plant remains, but it's still in the minority. And the graph at the top, of course, compares that to the percentage non-shattering. So as rice evolves to become more domesticated, it also is increasing its market share of the archaeobotanical assemblage. And once it is fully domesticated, we tend to get some sites that are close to 100% rice, very high levels of rice. Things like acorns completely disappear from later sites. And you can see that in the lower graph, that the kind of sites that have very small proportions of rice disappear. So this I would take as our marker to the shift to agriculture, and with agricultural based sites emerging between 4500 and 4000 BC, and the kind of trailing away of the wall. Something that's very emblematic of the establishment of fully agricultural economies in the lower Yangtze region are the emergence of sites like these, which actually have small paddy field systems. So those features you see being excavated there with the dark soils, these are 2 meter long, 1 meter wide paleo paddy fields with paleo soils where the rice was being grown. So they're artificial landscapes for agriculture. Now, if we shift our focus to Western Asia, to the Near East, what we classically refer to as the Fertile Crescent, we know that's the area of wild wheat and wild barley, and where those were therefore domesticated. And we can play the same games in terms of gathering the archaeobotanical data to look at non-shattering and to look at grain size change in wheat. And there's a few different wheat domestications, especially einkorn and emmer, and also barley, as well as several other species like lentil pea and chickpea that come from this region. And this is what the data looks like for the cereals. So the proportion of non-shattering barley rachis against median age at the top, emmer wheat in the middle, einkorn wheat at the bottom. And what you can see is they go from basically all wild types at 9000 BC to pretty much all domesticated types by the time you get to 7000 BC, with intermediate populations in between. And the bit I've highlighted there in gray is a kind of a period that I refer to as entrenched pre-domestication cultivation. That's the period when evolution is really taking place in the crops. That's that period I outlined before, where all of that co-evolutionary process is happening. And we can use data like this to do things like estimate rates of change and coefficients of selection, but that's detail for another time. And we can do the same sort of thing with seeds. Of course, there's a lot more seed metrics out there. This takes, again, the same 2 wheats and barleys, data from the Near East, and then later data right across Europe. And one of the things that's striking is if you look at the bit in gray is, again, the same. That's that pre-domestication cultivation period. Average and range of grain size is increasing quite rapid and quite linearly in that period. So the change in the size of wheat grains or barley grains that takes place between 10,000 BC and 7,000 BC is really marked, and much greater than any of the evolution that's happened in the last 9,000 years. And I would include all the genetic modification and stuff that's happened in the 20th century, In terms of grain size, massive change during the domestication process, minuscule change over the last 8,000 years or so. A lot of variation. So over time you get a lot of this variability, but you can see that early period of fairly marked change. And we can also then look at things like size change in pulses. So we've got lentil, pea, and chickpea from the Near East here, and soybeans from China, again showing periods of size change. And all of those data, then we can plot again on timescale. So this takes the non-shattering data from the Near East of those three cereals, puts them on a single graph, and then looks at average grain width, so grain size, just in terms of the population average, for each of the each of the wheats, barley, lentil, and pea. But in this case, we've put them all on one graph because we've turned that average grain size into a percentage increase. So what is the percentage change? Percentage increase from how it began. So you can see that these coevolutionary processes very much overlap in time for these crops in the Near East. Now, of course, that has a massive impact on society because these crops, as they become domesticated, are more productive and they're providing more calories. And we see the increase in human community size, population density over the same period. So again, the gray on that graph is the same. And this is a plot of archaeological sites against median age based on the estimate of the site size. So how big the site is, how big the village is, tells us something about the scale of population. And so you can see that prior to domestication, at the very beginning of the cultivation, your largest sites are about 2 hectares. And by the time we get to the end of the process, your largest sites are about 16 hectares. So there's an increase in population that goes with this. Now I want to quickly illustrate how we can, we're now starting to get data to look at crops in other parts of the world. So recent work in West Africa, particularly in Mali, looking at the domestication of pearl millet, which is really a staple grain of the savannas of Africa. You can see the wild distribution there and the map on the right, and the sites I'll be talking about here on the left, including some in the far north of Mali. And like the other cereals, this one shows a change from wild shattering dispersal to non-shattering seed dispersal, domesticated one on the right. But in pearl millet, the way that works is it develops a little stalk at the base of the grains, which it doesn't come off, has to be broken off, has to be torn off. The other thing that you get with domestication is a doubling of the grain. So on that stalk, you tend to get 2 grains or 3, whereas in the wild form, you have only 1. Now, many of the sites in this region are not very well stratified, so we don't have as many grain and chaff remains from the early sites. We do sometimes have grains, and there's some drawings and an SEM in the middle there. And so, of course, we can measure grain size. But the way we've been studying domestication here is using the pottery. So the ceramics that they're making are being tempered with the chaff of plants they're using in a particular pearl millet. And so we have pearl millet chaff mixed with the pottery, and then it leaves behind impressions, kind of fossils where the chaff has burnt out. And we can make casts of those fossils. So conventionally we've worked by using silicone and making casts, which are what are shown here on the left and the right. And those casts can then be sputter coated with a bit of gold and stuck in a scanning electron microscope, and we get very nice images. And you can see the examples on the left where you've got the spikelet with the little stalk at the base. That tells us it's a domesticated type. Below a paired spikelet, so a pair of spikelets together, that tells us it's the domesticated rather than the wild type. And the right, some with the stalks. So that's some work I'd done some years ago, but we had very, very small sample size. Recently, we've been able to up our game, so to speak, with new technology, and this is through the application of micro CT scanning of whole sherds at a facility that I've collaborated with at Australian National University, and you can see the images above there. So there's a sherd, and the kind of yellowish tan parts in that sherd are all the organic. So that sherd is chock-a-block full of chaff temper. So in the past, we've just lifted silicone impressions from the surface where we happen to get a good one. Here you can pick out as many of good as you want from the body of the sherd, and you can rotate those CT scan images in 3 dimensions. So what that shows on the left is C and D are wild type spikelets, and these are from a site called AZ22 in northern Mali, which has 100% wild shattering type single-grained spikelets. And it dates to about 4500 BC. And then at MK36 and MT25, which date later than that, to the kind of 3rd millennium BC, we start to get the domesticated types, and so a proportion of them. So we're able to put that data together. It's a relatively small data set, but you can see both an increase in the presence of paired spikelets in the lower graph, in the upper graph, the presence of the non-shattering spikelets. And we've kind of done a maximum minimum estimate of how many are present. And then below, measurements of grain size over time for pearl millet. So again, we have now a domestication process, a domestication window in terms of the time frame and region for pearl millet in northern Mali. Now, what all of these cases have in common is that the domestication process is slow. We're looking at 3,000 to 4,000 years for the evolution of non-shattering and the grain size increase. They're evolving at the same time. And so that has real implications for how we understand domestication. Now, an older paradigm, when I was a student, more than 20 years ago, I was always told we need to explain why. We need to find the cause. That should be our primary job, is to explain why. And there are a lot of theories out there. It's a climate change event, a social change, population pressure. And that made sense to have a single cause, a prime mover, when domestication was rapid. When it took only 20 or 100 years, as we used to think 20 years ago, then you could think about a single causation, a single strength of selection, a strong bottleneck. Lots of things were built on this notion. The new paradigm that's emerged through the recognition that domestication was a slow process is we're dealing with a protracted episode. It takes 3,000 to 4,000 years to assume a single cause and to assume a single rate of change implies that neither the environment, the climate, nor culture has changed in the 3,000 or 4,000 years over this process. And it doesn't allow for the plant populations under cultivation to be moved around to different microenvironments. So instead, we need to think about multiple causes at different points along that process that push it along, both push factors and pull factors. And so there's plenty of time for it to look quite complicated in both genomic terms and cultural terms. And so we need to rethink the way we go about explaining domestication and the origins of agriculture. Now, as a first step to doing that, I'd like to suggest that we have the tools now to start to map this out in time and space, to create the timescale windows against which to think about this. And I've tried to do that here for the 3 regions we've looked at, China, the Near East, and West Africa. And what the strong dashed line with the circles represents is the period of pre-domestication cultivation, an earlier phase, and then a later phase, which are called entrenched pre-domestication cultivation, which is when the evolution of non-shattering and grain size change is increasing in speed somewhat and is more obvious archaeologically. So we've got those time spans there. And then the boxes at the top tell us when we have our first sedentary villages. The crosses tell us when we have our first domesticated animals in that region. And then the triangles try to frame the transition to a agricultural economy. So the top triangle at 80, at 0.8, represents when you have 80% of all the plant remains from that site or sites in that region consisting of crops. Prior to that, you have a mixture of hunting and gathering and farming. That's the idea. And so you can see that the trajectories are similar with these variables, but they're not the same. But that allows us to start to think about then what are the factors that might be at play during this process. And I'm not going to I don't want to delve into the details here, but we can do things like this. So we've got here for the Near Eastern case, which is the earlier one, we've got a human population proxy based on summed radiocarbon date probabilities, suggesting that there are increases in population, the bits in pink there. So those are sort of increasing rates of population growth, and below that, a kind of climate proxy in terms of climate change. So the shift from the Pleistocene to the Holocene is quite obvious from the younger drive. That's that blue marker. And in fact, most of domestication is taking place in the Near East during a period where climate is actually much more stable than it was either before or after. So a climatic cause seems very unlikely now. This is looking at the same sort of thing for the Saharan case. So we've got a population proxy that's been published for the Sahara. What's interesting is you get this huge population growth in the early and middle Holocene in the Sahara because it's greener and wetter, so people are living out in the green Sahara. As that population starts to decline, it starts to get dry and people move south. That's when we start to see this domestication process in pearl millet. So there is something that could be related there. The end of the process and the emergence of villages is close to another real dry event, the 4.2 event. So there might be some climatic factors in Africa, whereas they don't appear to be the case in Western Asia. And again, we can look at similar kinds of things for China. So there's some climatic proxies for China. And in a sense, it falls between these two kind of dry events in a period that's generally wetter and more, the climate is generally better in a sense for plant productivity. What I'd like to do is just sum up some of the key points. Domestication and agricultural origins were slow. They're also not the same thing. So domestication takes 3,000 or 4,000 years, and so does the transition to agriculture. They're not happening synchronously. The implication of that is domestication is not the solution to a problem. It's not people working out how to solve a problem. It is, and it doesn't have a single causal mechanism. It's a co-evolutionary process in which there are contributing factors in terms of what people are doing, and in terms of how the plants are evolving, and in terms of the environment. And there are inherent pull factors. So the domestication process itself creates plants that are more productive gradually. That's, of course, going to entice people to put more efforts into them. Those more productive, more plants with more domestication traits become more dependent on humans, and therefore they require more human labor input to, for example, thresh and separate the grains and then plant those grains. And so the unintended consequences creates this kind of trap where more and more human labor is required to maintain these domesticated plant populations, but these domesticated plant populations provide more and more calories per field than gathering the wild ones would have done. And so this kind of draws people in. So that's one of the factors that's common, I think. Now, of course, this occurred in parallel many times in different regions, and to varying degrees, the hunter-gatherer components of the economy persisted for thousands of years alongside cultivation and the domestication process. In cultural terms, some of these early domesticators already lived in villages year-round. Some didn't. Some had livestock. Some didn't. Or some adopted livestock early on. Some didn't. Some had ceramics. Others didn't. So there's no kind of universal here. But all of them had technologies for intensive plant use or plant cooking, and they went through a process of elaborating those technologies alongside the domestication process. And that's the development of things like fancy cooking pots, which we get in China and Africa, development of ovens and sickles that we get in the Near East. And so there's a sense in which there is a kind of technological coevolution as part of this process. Now, I've probably spoken a little bit too long already, so I will stop here, and we will hear from another speaker, and I look forward to the discussion. So thanks for listening.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us in this session of ICArEHB Dialogues. We had an immense pleasure of listening to Dorian, and, well, after seeing this, I was like, well, I'm going to talk after this brilliant presentation. So, I think I will focus this talk on current issues and novel methods that I consider are changing our understanding of the origins of agriculture, but also on why this is such a relevant matter for our understanding of ourselves, but also of our own very survival. And emphasis will be on agriculture and plant domestication, as this by chance happens to be my field of specialization, but hopefully some of the considerations can be applied to animal domestication, and indeed we should not see animal and plant domestication as distinct phenomena, but rather as manifestations of the same interaction between humans and their ecosystems. For better and worse, the domestication of plants and animals changed dramatically the way most human beings in the planet interact with each other and with the environment around them. And that is why, I think that's why the topic is so fascinating for archaeologists. Agriculture brought about a dramatic cultural shift that would spread throughout the world. So the origins of agriculture and plant domestication has been an obvious source of interest to archaeologists, but to biologists as well. And frequently this has been a fruitful collaboration. For example, de Candole's interest in the first farmers of Europe probably arose from the then recently discovered lake-dwelling sites in his native Switzerland, and Vavilov's ideas of the centers of origins were a major influence in how we think about domestication. And like successive generations of archaeologists, they pondered about the big questions in plant domestication. And Dorian focused rather well on the big questions, which in a nutshell are the where, when, how, and why. And for the first three, enormous progress has been made, whereas for the why, well, that's been proven a bit more contentious, which is fine, right? We need something to argue about. And of course, the million-euro question: why did people stop being hunter-gatherers and adopted agriculture? This is both the most difficult, most relevant, and most exciting question, and a disparate range of proposals have been made. And alas, I fully agree with Dorian that it is a bit of a fool's errand to look for a single or even a primary cause. Most likely different factors acted and interacted with each other, and their relative relevance varied from one center of domestication to the other. But this said, we can compare the different cultures that adopted full agriculture or pastoralism and investigate which factors, environmental, social, cultural, population, etc., were more relevant in each case. Although, let's face it, we all know it was aliens who taught us how to tile the land, right? Well, but nonsense aside, investigating the origins of agriculture is a tremendously multidisciplinary endeavor, and that is what it makes it so rewarding and thrilling. And true, it can be said that archaeology as a whole requires input from many different fields, and yet determining the origins of agriculture really demands the input of different experts. And surely there are many more that I just could not be fit into this slide. But of course, it all starts and ends with archaeobotany and the plant data from the ground. But this dialogue between different sciences, for me, really is the most interesting aspect of this field. And recently, the big four questions have somehow given place to new and more focused interrogations. For example, instead of asking, where did agriculture appear? Another intriguing question is, why did it not appear elsewhere? And in many parts of the world during the Holocene, hunter-gatherer cultures have developed sophisticated strategies for resource intensification. As an example, archaeological and ethnographic data suggest that people throughout Australia could have been cultivating, in a way, a range of wild plant species and even transporting their favorite cultivars around the territory. The technology and the culinary practices that Dorian proposes as preconditions for agriculture seem to have been present there, and yet there are no signs of a transition to an agricultural lifestyle in Australia. But almost everywhere, people depended on plant resources and had an intimate knowledge about them. So why didn't intense cultivation and maybe later agriculture take off in more places? There are also other places that, for one reason or another, have not been so intensively investigated from an archaeological point of view. These are gaps in our global understanding of the origins of agriculture. And in some of these, the transitions to farming happened that may have been more or less independent occurrences, and then led to social complexity, urbanism, and eventually even state formation. The Horn of Africa is a case in point. In the Ethiopian islands, many crops are assumed to have been domesticated from local native wild plants, and the donkey may even be native from this region too. And the early agriculture in this region was influenced by Southwest Asian crops arriving via the Arabian Peninsula, like barley, wheat, and lentils, and from West Africa and the Sahel, with crops like sorghum and cowpea. But we know very little about how the local and exogenous combined, leading to a transition to farming that would result in the emergence of powerful polities like the pre-Aksumite culture of the first millennium BCE, and of course the monumental Aksumite. And in fact, one of our students, Dexiu Zerihun, is looking at crop genetics and environmental clues to elucidate the emergence of agriculture in the Ethiopian highlands. And we know quite certainly that agriculture made its appearance only at the beginning of the Holocene after the end of the Ice Age. But why not before? Modern humans had been around for quite some time, and based on Paleolithic archaeobotanical finds, we know that they were also intimately knowledgeable of their plant resources. So why didn't agriculture take off before? And the traditional answer to this question is that the cold and unstable climate of the last Ice Age made sedentarism and dependence on agriculture impossible, or in any case not favorable in energetic and nutritional terms. And that may well be true, but there is strong evidence that 14,000 years ago, sedentary communities, or what looked like sedentary communities of the Natufian culture in Southwest Asia, were using wild cereals, pulses, and tubers, including they were baking breads, apparently. And the frequent occurrence of grain processing technologies and artifacts suggests that these were not uncommon. But nevertheless, there is scarce proof for an extensive cultivation of wild resources, let alone farming. But why didn't the Natufians do like other regional cultures 4,000 years later and embark on a full-scale cultivation of wild resources? Was it that the availability of these wild plants was too unpredictable? Does it have to do with cultural preferences or social dynamics? And another intriguing question is why so few plants were actually domesticated? According to botanists from Kew Gardens, there are about 400,000 plant species in the world, and of these, only 7,039, it's a very precise number, are edible, and only 417, so just 6% of those edible plants, are considered cultivated in any way or shape, with only a few hundred contributing significantly to food supplies. And amazingly, just 15 crop plants provide 80 to 90% of humanity's food energy, 3 of which, rice, maize, and wheat, make up 2/3 of the world calorie intake. So why so few species were domesticated? Is it something to do with the genetic architecture of the plants that became crops that makes it more likely to be changed by artificial selection and to have favorable traits fixed? Is it the ecological range of some species that makes them amenable to domestication? Or was it simply a matter of culinary preferences of early farmers? And to answer this question, we must understand the domestication process of each crop individually. And this will help us comprehend why hunter-gatherers around the world intensified the cultivation and eventually deliberately or accidentally domesticated some species and not others. It is an enormous task, of course, as each crop has its own story to tell. And some have been much more studied than others. Those that are economically important, like maize or wheat, receive more funding and more interest. Also, crops from the three main centers, Mesoamerica, South Asia, and East Asia, are also more thoroughly researched. And I'm actually currently working on comparing the domestication process of pulses with the far better studied cereals in Southwest Asia and the West African centers, precisely to try to understand how distinct the domestication of pulses was. And then, of course, some crops were not domesticated for food purposes, and these rarely show up in the main narratives of plant domestication. And not only that, a number of crops have multiple uses. I'm also currently starting a very exciting project in collaboration with Ferran Antolin at the Deutsche Archaeological Institute and Aurélie Salaver in the Natural History Museum in Paris, looking at the genetic aspects of the domestication of opium poppy. And there are many, many fascinating aspects about this particular crop, but one of the most intriguing ones is that we actually don't know why it was, if it was cultivated as a medicinal plant, a source of recreational drugs for its oil, the culinary uses of its seeds, or as animal fodder. And on this note, it's worth to point out the possibility that some crops, including even cereals, may have been domesticated and cultivated not just for the purpose of feeding humans, but of feeding animals. And in Southwest Asia, domestication of wheat, barley, and pulses was almost contemporary with the domestication of taurine cattle and sheep, all of which can be fed during winter with cereal straw or pulses. And there are in fact suggestions that oat and millets were originally cultivated as fodder and only later used in human diets. This is an aspect that Roz, I, and some other collaborators are currently reviewing, and this is an effort by no means unique, but an effort to break away from the specialization of our particular fields and trying to look at food procurement strategies in general, rather than the particularities of plant and animal domestication. Allow me now to highlight some of the methodological novelties that emerged recently and that I consider are impacting the study of the origins of agriculture. And this is a selective and obviously incomplete list, and I would love to hear from you all about other aspects that you think are advancing the field. LiDAR surveying combined with satellite data, the fancy called space archaeology, is revealing agricultural practices in places where it was considered to have never existed. In the Amazon rainforest, this method has revealed mound villages, suggesting a population density and sophistication that was very likely to have been sustained by agriculture. And in fact, this region coincides with the biogeographically inferred origins of some crops such as manioc and, oh praise the gods for their gift, cocoa. And LiDAR and satellite imaging will be useful for exploring past agriculture in countries and regions where, unfortunately, conflict and social unrest has made it impossible to carry out excavation. But really the biggest amount of data in the past 15 years, though, has come from omics technologies. And these are a veritable ongoing revolution in the biological sciences and are offering a new understanding of many biological and ecological processes, including domestication. And this slide, again, is far from complete, but the important thing is that most projects begin the same way, by comparing domesticated plants and animals with their wild progenitors and using archaeological materials to complement and improve these data. These technologies vastly expand our understanding of the domestication syndrome. The traits those traits that differ between the wild and domesticated plants. Consider transcriptomics. Recent studies have highlighted that some of these differences between wild and cultivated crops are due not to mutations in key genes, but in the way that some genes are switched on and off. For example, hundreds of genes are active in teosinte, but switched off in maize, and vice versa. And this affects a phenotype, but is not necessarily inherited and depends on environmental pressures. And sometimes there's on and off button of genes, which is due, well, there's other mechanisms, but some of them are epigenetic mechanisms. These are fairly unexplored in the domestication process, and there's a lot of work to do on this aspect. They are, however, known, these epigenetic mechanisms are known to underlie the need for vernalization in wheat. So the difference between spring and winter varieties is not so much on the level of the DNA sequence, but on how certain genes are inactivated under certain conditions. So using genomics to investigate domestication is simply not enough, is not the end of the story. Other projects have looked at how different certain chemical compounds or metabolites are in crops and wild progenitors, both qualitatively and quantitatively. And we know that, for example, in legumes, domestication involved a marked reduction in the level of toxic compounds, but sometimes these differences reside in less obvious or deadly biomolecules. Emmer wheat domestication, for example, reduced significantly the level of unsaturated fatty acids in the grain, and the domestication of watermelon promoted an increase in sugars, which is why obviously it's such a delicious summer fruit. And of course there is the potential of using this knowledge about metabolites that are different in wild progenitors and crops. There's a potential of using these trying to detect them in archaeological seeds, so that this will be another method of determining their wild or domesticated. Plant phenotyping is a very exciting range of technologies. Now, if you can imagine a conveyor belt in a big greenhouse with hundreds of pots are placed in the conveyor belt, and each with a single plant of a given variety. And then the pots stop at stations where they get the same amount of water, they get their biomass calculated by automated image analysis, temperature checked, emission of oxygen calculated, etc. And all of these from early seedling to maturity, with measurements automated and taken every few hours or so for 2 or 3 months. Given the homogeneous environment, any observed differences are attributed to the genome, or at least to the epigenome. And it also allows us to look at unexplored aspects such as root architecture or biochemical processes. And this can reveal novel components of the domestication syndrome, but also bring rigor to known traits. In a rather thrilling collaboration with the National Plant Phenomics Centre in Aberystwyth, Wales, we carried 3-dimensional CT scans of wheat ears, and from the images, automated ways of carrying some measurements in the grains. And we observed the same trends in grain shape and area occurred during domestication in both einkorn and emmer wheat, and also red wheat, of course, something that Dorian also pointed out before. And next-generation sequencing technologies that appeared in the mid-noughties, but really exploded in the 2010s, were a real game changer. To give you an idea, the first draft of the human genome, so that is the complete 3 billion sequence of ACTTTGs that exist in our set of 46 chromosomes, took 10 years to obtain, and at a cost of more than $3,000 million. And at the time it was rightful, and even now it is rightfully compared to the moon landing. However, right now, we can easily sequence your own personal genome in 24 hours for a cost of around $2,000, probably even less these days. And of course, these technologies don't apply just to humans, of course, and recent projects have sequenced the complete genomes of many crops, as well as their wild progenitors. Sometimes thousands of varieties of each species. So we really have moved on from genetics, that is comparing certain genes in different individuals, populations, or species, to genomics, where we compare their complete genomes. And the amount of information we can obtain about the process of plant domestication and which genes or traits were affected by it is absolutely mind-blowing. But mind you that it does not automatically translate into the truth. And as the old adagio goes, information is not knowledge and knowledge is not wisdom. And here is an example. To elucidate the origins of rice, the genomes of 1,083 Oryza sativa and 446 Oryza rufipogon, so the wild rice, accessions from throughout the Asian range of the species were sequenced. And 5 million point mutations were detected, which is a staggering number by all accounts. However, the same dataset was analyzed by 3 different groups, and the first concluded that rice was domesticated only once in southern China. The second group found clear evidence for at least 3 domestications, and the third group suggested a mixed model of a single domestication followed by several introgressions into cultivated wild rice. So same data set, 3 contrasting stories. And these discrepancies have to do with, they don't have to do with the quality of the data itself, but it has to do with the different methods of analyzing genomic data sets and the different underlying assumptions. So just like with archaeological data, really, genomics data requires researchers to agree on methods and on interpretation. And to complicate matters, it has recently been observed that wild rice has been so introgressed with DNA from domesticated rice at different points in the last few millennia that most wild rice populations are just hybrid or feral varieties. And this has disquieting implications for the whole assumption that comparing wild and domesticated plants alive today can instruct us about the origins of agriculture. In fact, it is my opinion that fertilization has not been properly addressed. It is assumed that crops evolved from wild stands into regionally adapted land races and then recently improved cultivars. But in fact, what happens frequently is that cultivated plants will acquire wild phenotypes if a field stops being cultivated or if some plants escape from the fields. And these feral varieties will look exactly like wild, and they are in fact frequently indistinguishable from wild plants. This process of fertilization, or de-domestication as it is sometimes known, is not completely understood. Sometimes it happens by hybridization with wild plants, at other times by spontaneous mutations that appear in the crop, or changes in gene expression that make the plant revert to a wild aspect. And this phenomenon has been recorded frequently for many crops, ranging from rye in the United States to wheat in Tibet. So when geneticists compare crops with their wild progenitors based on the taxonomic classification of accessions, which is normally based on morphological characteristics, it will have a profound impact if some accessions look wild and are classified as such, but are in fact feral descendants from cultivated varieties. And for example, this has recently been demonstrated to be the case for some wild African rice populations. And for eggplants as well, where some accessions classified and actually looking like the wild progenitor of eggplant are in fact genetically similar to domesticated populations. Some wild barley accessions have been found in Tibet and in Morocco that were classified as Ordium spontaneum, the wild progenitor of barley, which is found abundantly only in Southwest Asia. And some claims were made that there were independent domestications of barley in Tibet and Morocco. And Diane Lister and colleagues, including myself, have looked at a collection of wild and cultivated barleys, and what we found is that all wild barleys from Tibet, they descend from cultivated barleys from East Asia. They show here in this structure results in green. This population is shown here in green, and they are genetically, these wild barleys from Tibet, they're completely different from all the other spontaneum accessions from Southwest Asia that are shown here in pink. So there is very little room for doubt that the so-called wild barleys from Tibet are in fact feral varieties. And the same is true for another form of barley, Ordium agriochrethon, that was at times even considered wild or even the progenitor of six-root barleys, but it is also very clearly a form of feral barley, albeit different accessions may have experienced different fertilization processes. I have also encountered this with wheat. This is a genetic study I did using the Axiom 35K SNP array, looking at mutations in the genomes of 645 present-day tetra and hexaploid wheat landraces and wild accessions. The PCA indicates a clear separation according to ploidy level and wild versus domesticated status for tetraploids and spelt versus bred wheat for hexaploids. Now, the interesting thing is that in this collection there were 2 wild wheat, so Triticum dicocoides samples, analyzed by Salamini et al. in the late 90s. And these are, one is from Armenia, the other from Iran, but both have the typical dicocoides ear, but they have a tough rachis, so the quintessential trait to indicate domestication. And despite their wild phenotype, except for the tough rachis, genetically they are very clearly domesticated emmer and therefore are likely to represent feral forms. In another study I did looking at approximately 51,000 SNPs, point mutations, in 186 accessions of wild and cultivated tetraploid wheat, I observed that most dicocoides, so wild wheat accessions from the South Levant, today's Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, are a genetically distinct population, here in red, whereas most emmer and durum wheat belong to their own genetically distinct populations, to blue and green respectively. Whereas most wild dicocoides accessions from the Karashadag Mountains and other parts of Turkey and Iran, these have a mixed ancestry from all the other populations. Now, this to me suggests that these wild emmers, they're not wild at all, but again, some type of feral varieties. Or alternatively, maybe they represent semi-domesticated forms introduced here from the South Levant that later escaped cultivation. Genetic studies in the late 90s and early 90s suggested that all emmer and einkorn descended from these Karashadag wild wheat populations. But I can't say for sure about einkorn, but for emmer wheat, looking at these data, it seems like this Karashadag wild emmer, they descend from emmer, not the other way around, and they're probably not even wild at all. And I think the presence of feral varieties was more commonly recognized by an early generation of researchers. For example, in 1965, Daniel Zohari talks about wild emmers in Israel that suddenly acquired distinctive traits from a variety of emmer that had been recently introduced in Israel. An important aspect of studies of prehistoric agriculture is how it contributes to the improvement of our present agricultural systems. And one of these ways is direct, for example, by sampling populations of the wild progenitors of our main crops, either for reference collections or for genetic studies. And frequently these accessions end up in seed banks, like the famous seed vault in Svalbard, whereas the genetic diversity they harbor can be used for breeding programs that will produce varieties with increased yield and using less land space. For example, the two early departed Lydia Zapata and Leonor Peña-Chocaro from Madrid collected many land races of emmer and einkorn in Spain and the Moroccan Atlas, and these are now deposited in seed banks. Also, studies of the lost crops, once cultivated by native people of Eastern North America, can also be used in modern agricultural breeding programs. and they can even be turned into novel crops. And this is a rather exciting field of research, actually. If we can understand how prehistoric hunter-gatherers selected plant species to cultivate, and if we can understand the genetic and physiological mechanisms that underlie domestication, then perhaps we can recover these lost crops and domesticate them again, now with the use of modern biotechnology. So the process will take a few years rather than millennia. Even new types of food can be domesticated. There is a lot of interest in turning seaweed species into more palatable and nutritious food items. Or indeed, start all over again with our current crops and do de novo domestication. Now, if we know which traits to target in wild progenitors, and again using state-of-the-art technologies like CRISPR, we can obtain novel varieties adapted to the challenges of climate change, or to have a bit more of, or plants that have a bit more of that wild hardiness. And these are just some of the species that might become crops in the next few years, and they sound slightly better than eating insects, so we hope they're very successful. And some are lost crops of different prehistoric cultures, and I'm sure the archaeobotanists and ethnobotanists will recognize them, but others are just edible plants that are still not nutritious enough in terms of calories or nutrients, but might become so, whereas others might be used in new applications like biofuels and bioplastics. So, just to conclude, the origins of agriculture, and this is the really take-home message, that the origins of agriculture continues to be one of the most exciting topics in archaeology, although I might be slightly biased in this opinion. But because it was such a complex and protracted process that happened in different parts of the world, there are so many open questions about it. And novel technologies will no doubt assist both archaeologists and biologists working on this topic, and surely it will continue to be a rather enthusiastic and diverse field. And I hope I managed to convince you that understanding the process of de-domestication or fertilization is currently fundamental to understand how plant domestication occurred. And of course, this is not just blue sky research. In our work, we are giving a significant contribution to the gargantuan scientific endeavor of feeding a growing global population with less deforestation, less pollution, and all this in the face of climate change. Because for better or worse, 12,000 years ago, after the beginning of the agricultural revolution, paraphrasing Gordon Childay, farming took over the world, and it seems pretty obvious that we are not going back to hunting and gathering anytime soon. So thank you.
Thank you very much to Dorian and Hugo. I'm just pinning you guys to the chat. Right. So to kick off, we have a question from Sergei Sar. I hope I pronounced that right. Sergei, do you want to ask the question directly, wherever you are? If I can find, she might have disappeared. Anyway, she asked about the, sorry, we're just trying to find her in the midst of our many guests.
Unmute. Ah, okay.
You got it. Okay. Where are you?
Found myself. Hello.
Hi, Sergey.
Now I see myself on a big screen. Yeah, at some point of really beginning of Dorian's thing, I actually wrote, and that's what's the mechanism of the seed shattering? Like, did the domesticated plants add or lose some structure, or how does it look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not the same for every crop. So if we take the case of pearl millet, which I spoke about, pearl millet adds a structure. It adds a pedicel with domestication, and that pedicel is non-shattering. If you take the case, but that's a little bit less common. Usually it is a loss of function, which is partly developmental, right? It slows down or it stops a developmental process. So if you take a case of rice, and I think it works basically the same in wheat and barley as and millets, as when the grain matures, you get an abscission layer. So you have a set of tissue on the grain side and the plant side where the cells simply separate cleanly between the cell walls. And that's turned off. So the mechanism that causes that is turned off with domestication, or it's delayed. So there's been a lot of genetic work in rice, and some of the, there's a couple of interacting alleles, and one of them only kind of stalls that mechanism between a couple of rows of cells. So just a couple of cells thick, it stalls it long enough that it stays attached to the plant and doesn't fall off. But if you leave it on, if you don't harvest it and you just leave it on the plant for another month, it will eventually dry up and fall off anyways. So it's really just a stall, it's a delay. But then that's interacted with by other alleles that kind of strengthen that process. And then there's one gene that completely shuts it off and removes the abscission layer. So there's variable processes involved in different crops.
Right.
I would say we're at the early stage of really understanding it genetically. So, again, 20 years ago, people would say, oh, well, it's a single recessive mutation and you cross, the domesticated with the wild and you end up with a shattering type. But it's clear from, say, the work in rice that it's not that simple. There's a number of different potential alleles that are involved in that pathway of abscission scar formation, and different domestication processes have played with, have affected different parts of that pathway, and sometimes multiple parts of that pathway. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
We've got no questions as yet. I have a question. I always have questions. So both of you highlighted in your talk the role of wild plants in food producing societies. And there's a recent paper just published this week where you have microbotanical phytolith remains from Chattel-Hewitt by Marco Mandela's team, and also stable isotopic analysis from Amy Styrene in particular that's looking at that suggests that wild plants are quite important to early food producing societies. But why weren't they domesticated? And I mean, in archaeozoology, we assume that wild species such as antelope, there's this fight-flight reaction, but you obviously don't expect this in plants unless you're a triffid. But so are we missing something that might be a marker of domestication in wild plants? And also, when I talk about wild plants, I also mean like the whole sort of weed crops as well, of weed species. It's probably a big question.
Yeah, I mean, I'll have a first crack at this one, and then I'll let Hugo say something, I think, because that's not Fred, we just talked. I mean, I think there's a number of things going on. Obviously, people gather wild plants. So if you're just gathering plants, you might, assert a very weak selection pressure for something, but it's not going to lead to the domestication syndrome of this kind of co-evolution, codependence, right? So that's the domestications are kind of codependent. The domesticated wheat needs the farmer to harvest it and plant it, and the farmer is eating it. And so that's a very tight co-evolutionary development that comes through a process. Now, I think it probably is the case that there are more species that have undergone domestication or parts of that process in the past, the kind of lost crops. And one example from Chattel-Hewitt is there's a little wild mustard seed that turns up in vast quantities there, Descurinia sophia. It's in the storerooms, literally in the millions of seeds. I find it very hard to think that people could go out and gather that naturally from wild stands without cultivating it. But of course, it's not a crop today, and it disappears as a crop after Chattel-Hewitt, as far as we know. So it might have been cultivated there. So there were some wild species that might have been cultivated in the lost crops. But of course, you know, you cultivate a few fields of wheat, you can still go out in other seasons or while the wheat is growing and gather acorns and gather wild almonds and gather tubers. And they're doing a lot of that at Çatalhöyük. And I would say most of the Neolithic cultures that have good data, that was true in the case of the lower Yangtze that I talked about. You know, these early rice cultivators are gathering acorns and water chestnuts and a wide range of other wild resources. So there's still what I would call a mixed economy, an intermediate economy. And that really raises another question as to when do those wild foods become much less important? And we can see that in Europe as well. You know, if you look at the early Neolithics in Europe, whether it's LBK or whether it's the British Neolithic, those sites are full of hazelnuts. Sometimes they have acorns. They have lots of wild fruits and berries. Not so much the late Bronze Age, right? So if you take a British late Bronze Age site, you won't find any hazelnuts. You won't find any of these wild crab apples and things. But if you take an early Neolithic site, you'll find more hazelnuts than cereals. So there's a sense in which the early Neolithic, even if it's not a local domestication, often has a kind of mixed economy. So I think that's a much more widespread phenomenon. There's a separate question you asked about weeds. I mean, I would view some weed taxa as, I mean, I've tried to introduce the term domesticoid for them because they do undergo evolution under cultivation and they adapt to arable fields without becoming domesticated. So these are things
some of them become crops like rye.
Yeah, some of them eventually become crops, but that's a later process. So so things like oats, you know, domesticated oats probably turn up in the late Bronze Age only, but oats are not native to Europe. So they spread out of the Near East as weeds of wheat and barley into Europe. They're part of those agricultural systems. The most common weedy oat is Avena fatua. It doesn't really have a wild form. So it evolves under cultivation in the early Near East and spreads as a weed, totally dependent on cultivation. And then later it's domesticated into oat, thousands of years later. So those plants like that, weedy oats, lolium, there's Bromus seculinus, there's a whole list of these weeds in the Near East are what I would call domesticoids because they are reliant on that agricultural ecological niche. They adapt to it, but they don't adapt to it in the way where they are dependent on humans for seed dispersal in the same way, or they're a major food component. Some of them later become crops like oats and rye.
So almost in a way like sort of the commensal animals that we have.
Absolutely. So I would put them in the same boat. So I once tried to introduce that term parasitic domesticoid for both commensals and these weedy species, because in the sense of the same, they're taking advantage of that agricultural or that cultivated ecosystem niche, you know, whether it's a grain weevil eating grain stores or mice eating grain stores or weeds growing in that nicely watered and fertilized field alongside crops. They're taking advantage of that human labor, right, in some way. And they're becoming part of that system and adapting to it and spreading with it as commensals or as, you know, kind of domesticoids.
It does depend where you look at it. Like there was a few years ago, there was this theory that, well, we've looked at all plant domesticates or at least cereals in Southeast Asia, etc., and they all have this genetic architecture that just change 2 or 3 genes and they become domesticated. But that's a bit of a circular argument because, of course, if you're looking at things that were domesticated, of course, you're going to find commonalities. And the fact is, it just might be a complex answer where if you're a hunter-gatherer, there's plants in your vicinity. These are the stuff you usually eat. Maybe they are abundant in that ecological scenario. And after a while, you're just cultivating it. But I mean, some of it might just be accidental. Some of it might be cultural preferences, or, you know, maybe some species were easy to use a mortar and pestle. So you just select those because they're easier to cook and maybe you like their taste. I mean, it's a very interesting question why some species were turned into crops and others were not. I don't think there's an easy answer for that, but it's very interesting. It might be genetic, ecological, cultural. I mean, there's lots of research to do on that.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it's some of those things you kind of have to look at on a case-by-case basis, right? Plant by plant or region by region. One of the things which, Hugo mentioned for the Near East is there's evidence now for breads, flat breads being made out of wild einkorn wheat at 14,000, so long before we have evidence for cultivation. So that implies that the interest in making breads and bread-like products precedes cultivation of wheat and barley. So that could then be a contributing factor to the question, why wheat and barley? Because they contain gluten, they make nicer bread than in most other grasses, right? So if you're interested in bread, then you might be interested in those particular grasses. That's not the case in East Asia, where they go for, all the gluten-free cereals, millets and rice and things. But of course, those are being cultivated by hunter-gatherers who have developed boiling and steaming technology, right? And then ultimately they select for changes in the starch stickiness, the waxy gene for sticky rice and things, which kind of suits that kind of culinary tradition and those cooking systems somehow. So I think it is a complex process that involves a kind of cultural taste, but then it also involves some of the kind of genetic makeup of those particular species and how they respond to that interaction.
So since no one else wants to ask questions, in terms of so not every pathway is the same for each crop species, etc. Can we also say that they're not all destined for the human plate? Could some species have been domesticated for animal or basketry? I mean, I'm just,
absolutely. So, I mean, just like Linda Zeter has this idea of different animal pathways. I think she has 3 of them, right? I think for plants, there's 6 or 7 pathways, and I've started writing on this. And one of them is a kind of directed textile crop pathway. So if you look at things like cotton, I mean, there are a few cultures that process cotton seed as cooking oil, and like in southern Ethiopia, it tastes horrible. Most people wouldn't really prefer it. It's certainly not preferred there. It's like an oil of last resort. It's really not very nice. But obviously, people have domesticated 4 species of cotton: one from Mexico, one from Peru, one from Africa, one from South Asia, and they've selected for longer seed fibers that you can turn into nice clothes. We all love art. We all wear cotton, right? It's very important. So that's one that's clearly been domesticated for its industrial purpose. And there's a lot of other fiber crops, your jutes and
linseed
and things like that. I mean, there are some that are mixed purpose. So flax also has an edible oil seed that's very high in omega-3. So there's ongoing debate is it domesticated for the edible seed or for the fiber? But in some sense, that's probably a false dichotomy, because it can be cultivated for both at the same time initially. And then it gets selected for high fiber varieties and larger seeded varieties. And the same is true of hemp. My view is maybe like poppy, hemp is perhaps first cultivated for its medicinal and drug properties as cannabis, but then it gets selected for high fiber textile varieties too, quite early on. So people do cultivate things for different purposes. There are clearly some, again, what I would call secondary domesticates, so things that start off as weeds that then become domesticated as fodder crops. And that's things like alfalfa, some of the oats, so like the red oat that you have in Spain and Portugal and southern France. The Mediterranean oats generally probably are fodder crops, domesticated from weeds rather than for human consumption. I mean, there would be a much longer list if one sat down and kind of went through and tried to think.
Yeah.
And then, of course, like animals have, sheep can be used for meat, for wool, etc. I mean, it's the same thing with even cereals. They're not just food. You use the straw to thatch your house. You can use it in the northeast of Portugal. They use straw to make raincoats. So if you're a shepherd, you just cover yourself with those straw-made coats, and it protects you from the heavy rain. So who says that at some point people were also not selecting plants or intensifying their cultivation, not for their food property per se, but because the straw was really good and waterproof? Or, it's a bit like secondary products revolution, but for plants. And
and people can select for, multiple things at the same time. So, the green revolution was mostly about dwarfing cereals so they're really, really short. So there's less straw. So that more of the energy goes into grains and they can be harvested by machine. And of course, that's counteracting what might have been much earlier selection for long straw, because the long straw is very useful for thatch and for fodder and other things. So people in the Neolithic might have selected for taller cereals with more straw because the straw was a useful secondary product.
Yeah. So Sergei is back with another question. If I can.
It's Sergei.
If I can interrupt again. Are you back? Oh, she's not there. Yes.
Oh, she's there. She's there.
I'll unmute you, darling. You're
mute. Okay. Yeah, I'm just probably muted to not, put Spanish air conditioning all over the place. As ecologist, I have this question that, everything comes with trade-offs. So if you select for better nutrient content in your crops, either you have to increase the fertilizing, or you have to do something with the nutrient acquisition traits, I guess. And how would you select for the better nutrient content?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think, with the cereals, it's more about, they tend to be selected mainly just for their caloric content, right? So increased calories. That does come with what I would call the soil nutrient trap, in that if you want to grow, cereals that have more grains and you want to pack more cereals into your field, of course, you need more fertile soil. So it forces people to fertilize early. Most wild grasses are spreaders, and this is very clear with the wild rice, wild millets, but it's also true of the wheats, in that they have a kind of spreading root system and lots of side branches. So they take up more soil space, more real estate, because of course they need the nutrients from that soil. With domestication, you get selection for tall, straight plants that you can pack more of them into a field, right? And they're taller and straighter, so they're easier to harvest. But that, of course, comes at the cost, and that those plants, still need just as much nutrients and water, but they have less of a root system and spatial area to get it from. And so I think that forces people to do things like manure fields, to control those little paddy fields I showed from China. That's all about being able to control nutrient and water content of those little micro fields, so that you can pack in rice that's more highly productive and more nutritious, more calories per plant, but it requires that labor input on the human side. That's, of course, just for the cereals. There's lots of other nutrients that people might select for, but the cereals are not particularly nutrient, in terms of vitamins and minerals, not particularly nutrient rich. So most of the selection is focused on.
You do sometimes end up with nutrient deficiencies. Like you have cultures that depend a lot on rice. You end up with lack of vitamin A, not everywhere, but in some cultures. Yeah. So it did come with a lot of trade-offs. You were selecting for calories, but for example, in Southeast Asia, it's very clear that, and in other places in Europe, where we have skeletons of first farmers and the last hunter-gatherers, and that the first farmers most of the time were smaller, less healthy. So you win in calories, but you lose somewhere else.
Life history trade-offs. And in some places, I suspect that's kind of a nutritional deficit transition or something, is probably late Neolithic or post-Neolithic, or urban revolution or something, where you start to get more and more, larger populations more and more dependent on mainly just cereals, and then they don't have access to the wild resources and the wild fruits or the fishing and things, and so they end up with these deficiencies. So, the early rice cultivators who ate a lot of fish and gathered nuts and things probably didn't have any deficiencies, but later on, when you get to early urbanization in that region, you have a lot larger populations who don't have access to those other resources, and most of their calories come from rice, and they're going to have deficiencies.
Just checking, any last questions from our beautiful audience? So I'd just like to thank first our dialogue guests today, Dorian and Hugo. It's been an amazing pleasure, and I really hope, Dorian, that you'll come to Faro one day. We would welcome you with open arms. And But I'd also like to thank those who have appeared in other sessions. The videos are online on our YouTube channel. And thank you to you, the audience. Some of you have been with us throughout and making the time to join, which is now turning out to be very busy, hectic schedules of other Zoom seminars. And we've got to compete with like several brilliant seminars on Neolithic, just to name my sort of area. So next year we will be focusing on dispersal and migrations, and the full program will be sent to you who have registered in an email around December. So just as a final note, my colleague Vera is just going to say a few words. Take it away, Vera. If she's unmuted.
Vera?
I needed permission to unmute myself. So our ICArEHB director, Nuno Bicho, is doing one of these directorial less fun things than we're doing now. He's stuck in a meeting, which means I have the pleasure to say very short words to close this first ICArEHB Dialogues, which has been, in my opinion, a success. It's like we created a monster. We expected to be talking with a smaller crowd, and we were lucky enough to not be, to be speaking with a huge crowd. And I would say that we're all living through this crazy pandemic world, but a good thing that I think we have to hang on to is that right now we also became more aware of other ways of communicating, right? So we are not just stuck in our microscope, in our archaeological data set, in our office, or even within our research center, but now we can actually expand and have this kind of dialogues with the extended family of ICArEHB, but also with invited researchers like today, Dorian. And I think that has been really something that we have to think, and to think that hopefully we can maintain for the future. So Roz already said that we plan to keep going with these dialogues. I think they're super important for us to think about our research, to receive someone else's research, to think about it together, and that's really enriching. So in the name of ICArEHB Direction, thank you everyone for today, Dorian and Hugo, but also for all the past dialogues. And thank you to Roz, that this is her mastermind. So thank you.